Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the Tunisian political transition. The Tunisian political transition has been in turmoil for some time now. There have been some struggles over powers and prerogative, which is basically the main feature of the Tunisian polity since 2011. Socio-economic hardships, political deadlock were further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and seem to have brought this promising transition to a sudden and unexpected halt. So based on a legal interpretation of Article 80 of the Tunisian constitution, the Tunisian president, Saied, announced on 25th of July, 2021, his decision to dismiss the government of the Prime Minister Hicham Mechichi and assume all executive powers, suspend the parliament and the legal immunity of parliamentarians. He also took full control of the General Prosecutor's office. The Tunisian society is now divided more than ever between those taken to the street and those supporting the coup, even though it seems that a large majority so far has been in favor of the decision of the president. With us today, a number of experts, practitioners, academics, all from Tunisian background to discuss the situation and offer us their insights and ideas about the situation in Tunisia and what could come next, and offer recommendations on how to resolve this constitutional crisis. Before we start our panel, I would like to give the floor to the chairman of the International Center for the Dialogue Initiative, ICDI, Mr. Jamal Ben Omar, to give some welcoming remarks and introduce the center.
Thank you, Yunus, and welcome to our panelists and all the participants in this meeting. Tunisia has been an inspiration for us. When a few years ago came together, to reflect on the state of peace and conflicts in North Africa and the Middle East, when we started looking at the so-called Arab Spring and how it evolved in a number of countries in nasty conflicts, and when we started looking at what's been done to resolve these conflicts and what we can all do together as people who are from this part of the world. One shiny example that was the inspiration for us was Tunisia. Why Tunisia? Because when you look at the state of peace and conflict in this part of the world, from Afghanistan to Iran to Syria, Yemen, Libya, and so on, the Sahel region around us, what we see is that many of these conflicts that evolved before or during the Arab Spring have become very protracted conflict and inviting many interventions, foreign interventions and mediations. And but what they all have in common is that the failure to move on to chart a way forward, a peaceful way forward. In contrast, Tunisia, the country that invited the least of any foreign intervention, Tunisians by themselves negotiated and compromised and found a way on how to move that transition forward and move it forward in a very peaceful way. I remember when the revolution took place in Tunisia, and I was at that time working closely with the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He dispatched me, in fact, as the first UN official to visit Tunisia, to report back to him on what was happening. I remember in my report, I stressed the fact that there is a vibrant civil society in Tunisia, that there is leadership, there is political will, and that Tunisians will definitely find a way on how to move forward. Everybody was expecting me to propose the appointment of an envoy of the UN or briefing the Security Council on what's happening in Tunisia. I went against the traditional wisdom at that time and suggested that none of that would be helpful. Tunisians, the best way we can help the Tunisians is to leave them alone. And that's exactly what we did. And that's exactly what happened. Tunisians, when the transition got stuck, I remember in 2013, 2014, four non-governmental organizations came together and they facilitated a process that led to the transition moving forward. So this is why I say it's an inspiration for us in ICDI, because the whole idea of this center is to empower local actors, is to empower indigenous solutions, is to strengthen mechanisms that already exist at the national and regional level to peacefully resolve conflict. So the main idea for us is that if Tunisians were able to do it and move forward, other people in our part of the world should be able to do it too, and our role would be to empower them and give them space and support their effort. So that's why I said it's a shining example of a positive development in our part of the world, and that's why it was inspiration for the idea of setting up this center. We're sad to see that there have been difficulties, and nobody is surprised. These kind of transitions bring to light new contradictions, new issues, new challenges. But it is time to reflect where Tunisia now, and for me the main question is that can that spirit of compromise that prevailed in 2013, 2014, and can that feeling of moving forward with indigenous solutions, Tunisian solutions, which is what prevailed in 2013, 2014, can that spirit be resuscitated? Can an effort by Tunisians, again, prove to the world that Tunisia is able to move forward freely from any coercions or interventions, from those who have an interest, and those who, as we see it in many parts of the world, their interventions come with many fallouts and complications. So without further delay, let me hand over back the floor to you, and let us hear from our Tunisian sisters and brothers and experts and see what they would have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal, for these initial remarks. So we will start our panel discussion first with Yusuf Bahamud. And Yusuf Bahamud is a board member of ICDI and senior advisor at the International Peace Institute. He's been supporting sustainable development and peace operations program and serving as focal point on mediation and prevention policies and practices. He has a long career with the UN, former UN Under Secretary General, and has headed peace operations in many countries, including Burundi, the Central African Republic, and Chad. Prior to these assignments, he also held other senior United Nations positions, notably as UN Resident Coordinator in Guyana, Director of the UN Department of Political Affairs, and head of the Office of the Under Secretary General for Political Affairs. In 2015, Yusuf Bahamud served as member of the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Peace Operation, and simultaneously as a member of the High-Level Advisory Group for the Global Study on Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security. Yusuf Bahamud, you have the floor to kickstart the discussion.
Thank you very much, Yunus, and good to hear from you, Jamal. Thank you for bringing all of us together. And it's a pleasure and honor to share the virtual stage with fellow Tunisians. What I thought I would do, I wish to defer to the other colleagues to perhaps address the current situation. And what I thought I would do, based on my experience in post-authoritarian democratic transition, that I share with you some of the lessons that may explain why certain transitions succeed while others don't succeed. But before I do that, let me just make a quick comment on what my brother and friend Jamal said. You are right, Jamal. Tunisians have long forgone the proposition that if you want to change an effective corrupt government, you will have to wait for the next elections. They don't. And certainly they don't wait for being empowered, let alone given advice to. And this continues to this day. And so what are some of the main lessons that we can glean from the experience of countries that have gone through democratic transition and are still going through democratic transition in all parts of the world, but particularly post-authoritarian democratic transitions, which have a specific set of challenges. The first lesson is that transitions to democracy, or the transition to democracy, is a complex endogenous process of becoming, rather than, excuse me, rather than a externally driven end state. It is always perfectible, and therefore reversals should be expected. The only certain things about transition is that they are highly uncertain. The second lesson, we have found that societies that have succeeded in their transitions have in their DNA indigenous, resilient, and self-organizing capacities, which in times of national stresses and in times of crisis serve as a safety valve and enable these transitioning societies to pull back when they are at the edge of the precipice. Let me just give examples of these self-corrective capacities, one of which Jamal mentioned. The first one is a vibrant, well-rooted and independent civil society, and an elite that have the capacity to propose a vision and to reflect on what is happening and be able to share those reflections with the rest. Another example of self-organizing capacities is a legitimate constitution, a sense of national cohesion and solidarity, and in some contexts, a Republican army that stays above the political fray. As you have noticed these days, in some countries, when civil society rise up and they don't manage to change leaders, the military is usually behind, not far behind, to continue the job. Not the case in Tunisia. The other lesson is that constitutional and institutional reforms during democratic transitions are necessary and are important, but not sufficient. Democracies do not succeed without economic reforms, without improving the lives of the poor, and without dealing with unemployment, particularly when it is endemic. Another aspect, and this is particularly in terms of the rule of law, transitions to democracy has a fighting chance to succeed if there is an effective, transparent, and predictable legal system that prevents well-connected insiders from amassing wealth and public assets through shady backroom deals. Transitions succeed only when citizen believe that public institutions work for them rather than against them or only for elites. As a corollary, there is also the necessity for the reform of the judicial system that prevents corruption and impunity from becoming an entrenched new norm. It's a self-evident fact that I won't develop it any further. We could go back to it if you wish. Another aspect that characterized successful democratic transition is the devolution of power to regional and local levels. This aspect is judged as a critical ingredient in the process of consolidating an emerging democratic culture for obvious reasons. Let me just mention one of them. Decentralization increases grassroots accountability because they bring institutions closer to the people. There are so many other elements and lessons, but let me stop here. These are just lessons that I am sure most of you are familiar with. They are offered here merely as an aide-memoire to keep in mind as we address the question that Yunus has suggested for our deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yusuf, for framing the debate and providing few best practices and experiences from the global stage, and also for sticking to the initial time agreed upon. Let me now turn to Dr. Khadija Mualla, who has 30 years of experience in development, human rights, and gender, including 15 years in senior leadership positions in the United Nations. Dr. Mualla holds a PhD in International Development Law from University of Paris, and has a long experience, extensive experience in human rights, gender equality, governance, rule of law, international and civil society organizations. Dr. Mualla, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and pleasure to be with you all. So let me share with you very few thoughts that I've been thinking about this morning in preparation for this webinar. So since July 25th, since the exceptional measures taken by President Saied, I have the feeling that I am in Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. And I wanted to quote the question in the play, "Where were you? I thought you were gone forever." So in Tunisia, we have been witnessing almost on a weekly, if not daily basis, American senators, journalists, EU ministers visiting Tunisia and its president, of course. This made me ask myself many questions. First of all, why suddenly this interest in Tunisia's business? And is it really to advocate for democracy and promote human rights for the Tunisian citizens? And the other question was, why none of them showed up during this decade that witnessed an enormous economic crisis with more than 1 million youth unemployed or looking for a job, more than 2 million living under the poverty rate, where we didn't, where recently, because of COVID, we didn't even have vaccines, and COVID was killing more than 300 Tunisians per day. Some of us didn't have even oxygen to breathe. So I wanted personally to ask all these people that have been visiting us, where were you during a decade where Tunisian people were taken as hostage of the political Islam that stole every single thing they could? A decade where they killed, sent our youth to be part of Daesh, where they infiltrated every single sector of the public administration. My question is also directed to international organizations and donor countries who continued to provide grants and loans while maybe they knew, I hope they didn't, but maybe they knew that they were not benefiting the Tunisian people but all the corrupt mafia, including the political Islam. So I came today with more questions than answers, because it's very troubling to see American and European policymakers suddenly scared for our democracy, while I'm sure they must have known that it was a democracy of facade, a fake democracy, because it was the democracy of the corrupted and benefiting only the International Muslim Brotherhood movement and not the Tunisian people. So yes, we are in transition and the situation is not easy, but I trust the Tunisian people. I trust their emotional intelligence that no matter what, we will overcome this situation. And if the president will do what he says, let it be. However, if he changes his mind, then we will always know that vigilance is the price of freedom, and we will never give up on our freedom of choice to run our country the way really it should be run. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khadija, for these initial remarks on where we are now in Tunisia. And I hope we will not be waiting for Godot for a long time. And I note what you said about vigilance. While a majority so far of Tunisians seem to agree with the president in his actions, I think vigilance is key, because we still don't know where this is heading. And we will have to discuss this today also. Thank you. Let me turn now to Professor Fadel Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has held research affiliations with the Levy Economics Institute and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and job guarantee. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global South, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. His work has been featured in international media like New York Times, Financial Times, Bloomberg, Le Monde, and France 24. And he has also books on Tunisian political economy. Dr. Fadel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation and for hosting this this event for us. I want to draw our attention to the economics of this transition, the uprisings of 2010, 2011, and the aftermath, and then where we are today. And Dr. Mahmoud alluded to the importance of changing the economic engine to meet the demands of the public, of the people who have been the victims of corruption, of abuse, of socioeconomic neglect. And I feel like a broken record, because we've yelled and screamed for years from the beginning of the uprisings and the transition that, yes, we have to make progress and achievements on the democratic front, on the legal and justice front, on all the important political achievements, despite the challenges. But we cannot restart the same economic engine, the extractive neocolonial engine that actually produced the inequality, the unemployment, the corruption of the previous regime. And when you look at essentially all the political actors that we've seen on the Tunisian stage since 2011, there's this implicit assumption, which I fear President Kais Saied is also carrying this implicit assumption, that if we tackle corruption, cleanse the system of corruption, cleanse the system of the members of the former regime, but crank up the same economic engine, that the outcomes will be better. And when you look at the model that Tunisia and most countries in the global South have followed since independence, since the 50s and 60s, it's a continuation of the colonial extractive economic development model. And I'll start with a few observations at the global scale, and then we can zoom in on Tunisia. On a global scale today, if you divide the world in two groups, global North and global South, and you net out all the global financial transactions, we'll find $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. And this number has been growing continuously year after year for decades. This is kind of when you pay attention on a quiet evening, you hear this giant suction sound in the global financial system, sucking wealth and resources from the global south. And Tunisia is part of that system, extractive system. That extraction system is not just mining and oil and natural resources. It's a global financial system. So what are the engines of the Tunisian economy that everybody wants to restart, that all the countries in the global south use? These are basically the main kind of policy recommendations of the IMF and the World Bank and kind of the Washington Consensus. Accelerate tourism, accelerate exports, accelerate foreign direct investment, privatize state-owned enterprises to generate revenues to finance your economic development. And all of these engines, liberalize your financial system. All of these are traps, structural traps. Even though it may give you the appearance that these policies actually create jobs and generate foreign currency reserves and allow you to pay your debt, when you look more carefully, you realize that they're actually extractive. I'll give you the example of tourism. Tourism, yes, it creates jobs. Yes, it brings in foreign currency reserves, which a country like Tunisia needs to pay its debt to the World Bank, to the IMF, to foreign investors. But the more tourism you bring into the country, the more you have to import food. And we don't have food security in Tunisia. The more tourism you bring into the country, the more fuel you have to import to transport, heat and cool the hotels, and so on. Same thing with exports. Exports of assembled goods means you have to import the raw materials, the fuel to produce electricity, the technology to... So if you specialize, like many countries in the global south, if you specialize in producing low value added content type of manufacturing, you're always going to be in a trap, because the value added of what you import is much higher than the value added of what you export. So the faster you accelerate your production, the deeper you get in the trap. And all of these traps accumulate in the form of external debt. Because when you have a trade deficit, especially our type of trade deficit in Tunisia, is heavily weighed on food imports and energy imports. So the more we try to accelerate the economic engine that we've been using, the more food we have to import, the more energy we have to import. And I can add the impact of climate change and the dams that are empty in Tunisia right now, the farms that are going without water, and so on. So our problems are getting worse, obviously, with climate change. But the point is that all of these structural weaknesses translate into external debt. And now the government has a simple choice to make, a very difficult choice to make. Do we let the value of the dinar deteriorate even more relative to the euro and the dollar? And if we do that, everything we import the next morning is going to be more expensive in real terms. Food, fuel, medicine, you name it, everything else. And that means inflation, that means social unrest, that means political unrest. So that's choice number one. And we faced this choice in the 80s during the debt crisis, and we're facing it again as we speak right now. Choice number two is to artificially fix the exchange rate, strengthen the dinar artificially. And the only way to do it is by borrowing more dollars and euros to put a band-aid on this problem and postpone it for later. So these are the structural weaknesses that we haven't seen a coherent vision from any political actor on the scene for the last 10 years to change the engine of the economy, as opposed to restart it and accelerate it, because you accelerate it, you accelerate the effects of this problem. And I can come back later to what will be the solutions, what will be the alternative. But my final point here is that if we get rid of corruption, if we cleanse the political system of corrupt people and all of that, but crank up the same economic engine, we're going to be back in the same spot in a few years, if not worse, because our problem has been consistent since the 1960s, 1970s to this day. And we've been able to kind of put band-aids on these problems over time by accumulating more external debt and never addressing the root causes of this problem. So I'll leave it at this, and then we can go back later and talk about what could be done today. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadel, for this fresh look at another aspect that usually we forget to focus on, which is the issue of development or lack thereof, which is the main Achilles heel of most of these transitions, not only in our region, but around the world. And the fact that you put Tunisia transition in the frame of world system analysis, which is very important, not to forget that Tunisia, like all other countries from the region, are part of something that is more global and more complex. Now, let me turn to Wiam Shitiwi. She's a graduate of Oxford University. She's a Tunisian public policy specialist who focuses on security sector reform. And also, she's the president of the Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. She has diverse experience and previously worked as research at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and also the United States Institute for Peace. Wiam, you have the floor.
Thank you all, and thanks for this invitation. I guess the questions kind of that we were kind of recommended or encouraged to try and answer in this on this panel are, what is the current situation like? And I guess the next two sort of categories of questions that we'll be trying to answer will touch on the future likely scenarios and the recommendations that we might have. The recommendations around this idea of a political crisis. To talk about the first part, which is the situation at the moment, I very much want to borrow some of what Professor Fadl Kaboub was saying around the idea that fighting corruption on its own will not and is not going to be producing the sustainable changes that we want to see in terms of sovereignty on different fronts. If we just keep tackling just the corruption, because we are very much maintaining systems that some people can operate outside of a little bit, but if that system is not serving the majority, and especially populations that have been marginalized greatly, then we are definitely not going to see any solution. But I would like to take that and bring it closer to a field that I've been focusing on for a while, which is the security sector. And just as much as Saied has not really spoken clearly about, any kind of vision for an economic, alternative for Tunisia, and has even gone so far as to invite, leaders in the business elite to come as kind of saviors. Instead of prioritizing very much discourse around, for example, what we can do structurally to fix around national and public industries and services, I think it's really interesting that he hasn't also communicated very much around the security sector and any alternatives or changes or reforms that we could see there. So I think just as much as you can talk about, this being a revolutionary decision or an interruption in a path that was very much blocked to begin with, I don't think that things were going smoothly and this came and interrupted that. Obviously not. But just as much as there's that issue, we can also say that for such a radical decision to have been taken on July 25th, and that has even inspired people to go outside on the streets to celebrate and others to think of it as a coup, the radicality of the decision can't be negotiated or debated. It is very much a strong decision. That decision has not yet produced new discourse on alternatives. So where are we at right now in terms of the situation? Obviously, aside from the political kind of uncertainty that we are seeing, the gridlocks, the freeze of the parliament, we see, and this is kind of the field that I focus on, still very much a heavy dependence on the Ministry of Interior, as a kind of a mechanism for some of that discourse or decisions around corruption to be carried out. The issue that I'm noticing, and something that I kind of sprang to my mind on July 25th, it's on the very same day, is the current leadership in Tunisia in the form of Saied at the moment, really in control of the Ministry of Interior, really capable of figuring out how to make use of that mechanism. A lot of people studying the situation in Tunisia began to make, parallels with Egypt, kind of, fearfully kind of decrying this as an Egypt scenario where things can go very wrong and where we're on a clear path towards autocracy. And but the difference here is obviously the military in Tunisia is very different from the military in Egypt, but also the level of comfort that Saied has with the Ministry of Interior was very unclear to us up to that point. And to me, that was both good news and bad news. Obviously, that the fact that this, president is not necessarily of that institution or even close to it in any way in his, background, is good news in one sense. But given its importance in carrying out a lot of that work around cleaning and purging and dealing with corruption and dealing with deficiencies in the parliament, etc., political, all of it. To me, that was extremely concerning. And we see that very much in the form of, the travel bans that we've seen taking place. They can be debated. They could be good decisions if, truly they are going to be covering, answering a need to hold some people accountable, to avoid having people leave the country when they are obviously, if they were involved in corrupt practices. But at the same time, as long as no clear reasons and no clear communication is provided around why these decisions are being taken, who exactly is doing all the investigations around all of this, what procedures have been taken, and basically the reason why these travel bans or other actions are being taken. As long as that is not very clearly communicated, there's always that concern that even perhaps the presidency itself is not fully in control of that process. And I think that's something very important that we have to look at and focus on at the moment. So as far as the status quo, but at the same time, I was going to say one more thing. There is a small difference in the way that the security sector has been kind of dealt with during this not transition, but this period in Tunisia. The key difference for me was seeing how appointments were made. So a series of big changes were being made within the apparatus, and seeing a bad choice being made and then reverted on is both, again, good news and bad news, in the sense that the fact that someone is appointed who is a problematic figure in the security sector, clear response coming from the population and from the people of Tel and Gasrin who resisted this appointment of someone who was involved in very brutal crackdown against people of that region, is interesting and kind of good in the fact that it led to a reversal of that decision and that appointment. But it's also very problematic that that decision was taken in the first place again. So I feel like the current situation in Tunisia with what is happening right now, obviously is a situation full of uncertainty, a situation that is leading to a lot of that uncertainty in itself is leading to a lot of speculation, but also room for intervention in Tunisia's affairs by external observers, by foreign governments, trying to kind of say, oh, Tunisia should stick to this path or that path. But more problematically is within Tunisia, that uncertainty is leading to an increasing sense of unease, even among people and parties and politicians who at first came out strongly in favor of the decisions. And I think that's something that is going to be interesting to observe, in the sense that we are seeing a very quick change in how things are being carried out in Tunisia. It went from, radical kind of two camps, two opposing camps, to what happened on July 25th, to now increasingly kind of a request for more clarity in terms of the political situation, but also for people like myself who are looking at the security sector, a little bit more clarity about why people get fired, what is the process for selecting, and appointing new people, and altogether just a desire to understand better how, what are the steps forward. And I think we can talk a little bit about that in the likely scenarios. I'm going to stop there because I think I've been speaking for more than 5 minutes, but kind of that's the take on the current situation, with a little bit of focus on the security situation.
Thank you, Wiam, for actually pointing out the importance of security sector reform, because as I remember my work when I was in Libya and other countries, it has been always a major problem how to reshuffle and reform that sector. And it seems that in many transitions, the old reflexes come back again, and security becomes the main tool to police this newly or new society or new polity that the new power that be tried to create. And instead of looking at security as a public service provided to the citizen, it seems that it is more a tool to police them. And the second thing that I was thinking about when you were talking is maybe, as Fadel said earlier, maybe isn't it high time that we rethought our view of security sector, not crank up the same engine again as the old regime have, instead of thinking of something new, how to reorganize this sector. And especially in the case of Tunisia, that when you mentioned that there is a complete lack of communication and clarity on what basis decisions are made, and who decides what, and why this person is removed and not others. So it will be interesting to look more into this as we go along. I note also the word uncertainty that you mentioned a few times, which reminds me of the beginning of the discussion when Yusuf said that it is a key element of all political transitions, is uncertainty. We don't know where this is heading. And that brings me back then to the second phase of our debate, which is the likely scenarios. Where are we going in Tunisia? What are the possible and likely scenarios? And to discuss this, I'll go back and give the floor again to Yusuf to give us his take on the likely scenarios that Tunisia is probably heading towards. Yeah, Yusuf, you have the floor. I wonder if we have not lost Yusuf. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I've muted it to keep the noise of the drilling out of the scene. Let me mention as a comment on what I have heard one thing, and I know Khadija likes to also quote this fellow called Einstein, who one of the things he said is that you cannot solve today's problems with the solution that had created them. And this is an opportunity for us to invent a new solution, particularly at a time when there is an acceleration of the breakdown of existing paradigms at the economic and the political and the security field. So it's up to us really as Tunisians to reinvent, and I'll come to it later on. One possible scenario that agitates those absent friends that Khadija talked about, who were notable with their silence during the last decade, is that there is a risk that Tunisia may follow the populist scenario. And they bring three issues to the fore. The first one is that populists are mostly known for what they are anti or what they are against rather than what they are for. They are anti-elitist. And, and then the lack of vision seems to confirm that the president may be inching towards that. So that's one element. The second element or the second hallmark of populism, as we see it progressing, by the way, in Europe and elsewhere, is that they are anti-pluralist. In other words, because they feel they have direct mandate from the people, they are the best spokesman from the people. And therefore, there is no attempt to open a space for listening and for gathering different points of view and different ideas about where we should go next. The third hallmark of populism that people fear Tunisia may be heading to, in the absence of a constructive pluralist vision, is an interpretation of the law. It's an interpretation of the legislation. And so I am putting that as one possible scenario. I don't adhere to it. It's too early. We'll see what the president will come up. We keep being asked to wait, so we'll see what will come out soon. The second possible scenario, which is, in my view, depends on all of us as citizens, is to engineer and create spaces for proposition and for visioning and for making known our views at what should be the trajectory and how it should be managed. And this requires a particular type of leadership, where the leadership is not the leader in a position, but it's the ship. It's all of us coming together and harnessing those self-organizing capacities that I've mentioned earlier of civil society, the economists among us, the peace and security among us, the legal people among us. And I feel that Tunisians will rise up to the occasion and will not be just mesmerized for too long if there is no clear vision. And they will rise up again, rise up in terms of in the intellectual custodians, and they would want to co-future or co-author the future. So that's a second scenario that we will see, and we're beginning to see it. People coming up and saying, no, this is the direction, and we have a point of view to. So let me just stop there. There is a third scenario, but I don't want to take more time than necessary. And maybe when it comes to particular actions, we could see what we can do to prevent even the intimation that the populism is what we're heading to, and how we can engineer the second scenario to ensure that there is a pluralist sursaut to redirect and contribute, whether asked or not, where the trajectory of Tunisia should go from, so we don't use this unbelievable opportunity. And the window of opportunity, I'm afraid, that this crisis has provided us could be fast closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf, actually for juxtaposing the first scenario, which is more individualistic, with the second one, which is more of collective choice. And I know that it's dear to you, the concept of collective leadership, which is unfortunately lacking in most of our region. And it seems that it's regressing also around the world. Let's hope that the second scenario is more likely to happen than the first. Let me give now the floor to Khadija. Go ahead, Khadija, give us your take on what you think might be coming in Tunisia.
Okay, thank you very much. So since I left the United Nations in 2013, I left exactly the day Shukri Baid has been assassinated. And I left because I wanted back my freedom of speech. And since then, I must have published more than 150 articles in the 3 languages. But it's just to compare that for the since July 25th, I must have published and co-signed more than 10 articles, again, in 3 languages, to be able to reach out to as many audiences as possible. But definitely, I've been in many TV and radio shows, again, because it's very important to speak to the elite and write to the elite, but it's as important to be also able to publish in a sabah in Arabic, just for Tunisian people to understand what is it about. And one of those articles really answers your question, because I am speaking about this 3 scenario. It was published in L'Économiste Maghrébin, and where I imagine 3 scenarios: the good, the mitigated, and the bad one. So the good scenario would be definitely to very, very quickly have a small task force, a small government, a gender-balanced one with the most competent Tunisian to be able to run the country from now till 2024, prepare the election, but essentially face all the challenges we've been talking about: economic, political challenge, social and cultural. The mitigated scenario that we are maybe now witnessing is seeing all these mixed messages. Yes, we are fighting corruption, but not all the corrupted one. Yes, we are against the Muslim Brotherhood, but what are we exactly doing, and what exactly? We have ban on travel, but we have a ban on travel for business women and men. And the worst case scenario for me really would be to discover that in fact, it's not the president who is running the show, and that there are other superpower, other countries, other people who are trying now to save again the Muslim Brotherhood and to invent any type other of way out or any type of dialogue or anything. So to see again another black comedy, and this would be really scary. So for now, we are still waiting for Godot, I'm afraid. Thanks.
Thank you. I see that you have basically the good, the bad, and ugly in all these scenarios. And thank you for referring to, I guess, the regional and international ramifications of this crisis. Again, Tunisia is not an island. So what's happening in Tunisia, it has an effect on the region and internationally, and what's happening internationally and in the region also affect the possible scenarios in Tunisia. Fadil, we'll have to have a political economist view of the likely or unlikely scenarios in Tunisia. What do you think?
Yes, I'll try not to focus on the ugly. I'll try to put some potential roadmap, but I'll also highlight the challenges. It's not sufficient to have a clear, coherent vision for structural transformation. It's also important to recognize what are the obstacles. As I highlighted earlier, you can't run an economy without food. You can't run an economy without energy. And this has been our biggest problem in Tunisia since the 70s. And this is a consistent problem for the global South in general. This is the root cause of our external debt, essentially, from an economic standpoint. So the good news is that renewable energy potential is massive in the case of Tunisia, especially solar and wind and tidal energy. We have the skills, we have the natural resources for it, and we're a small economy. I'll give you an example. Over the last few years, there's been quite a bit of interest by German and British, other European companies to harness solar energy in the Tunisian desert, lay cables in the Mediterranean to export something like 4 gigawatts worth of solar energy to Europe. 4 gigawatts is actually the total consumption of the entire Tunisian economy. So the deal is to export renewable energy to Europe and for us to continue buying fossil fuels for our own economy. That's a new form of neocolonial extraction. And for some reason, this has been viewed as, great opportunity for the Tunisian economy. I guess this proposal by Desertec has been renewed over the last few months. I'm not sure where it's going in the future, but these are the possibilities. How can we export more, right? As opposed to how do we build a more resilient, independent economy and build from that resilience, right? So investments in renewable energy is a must. We're not going to go anywhere without sustainable energy sources domestically. I'll go back to the example of tourism that I mentioned earlier. Yes, tourism creates jobs. Yes, tourism brings foreign currency reserves. But if the foreign currency reserves that you earn from tourism are leaking out of the system because you have to import fossil fuels to run the hotels and the transportation system, and to import food because you don't have food security and food sovereignty, then all of your commitment to tourism as the great savior for the Tunisian economy is actually falling in the water, as we say. So that's point number one. Point number two is the importance of investment in food sovereignty, food security. And Wiam can tell you more about the work that many colleagues and farmers and activists have been doing over the last few years. We're barely building a critical mass in Tunisia now to recognize that the agricultural policies of the last 30 years have been a disaster. And we're gradually, very slowly reclaiming at least the concept of food sovereignty and the public space. And that has to be front and center of any government policy. So without those two pillars, we're not going to go anywhere. The third pillar of the structural weakness of the Tunisian economy is the type of industrialization that we've pursued. It's a classic case in the global south, which is a race to the bottom, a global race to the bottom, in the sense of specializing in low value added manufacturing, where you have to import all the components, all the technology, and rely on low cost labor, lower environmental standards, lower labor standards to assemble a finished product for re-export. So your contribution in that export and that production is low value added. Your import is high value added. You're always going to be in that trap. Now, how do you transition and kind of climb up the ladder from lower value added content of manufacturing to higher value added content of manufacturing? You can only do it by investing in research and development, education, technical training, infrastructure, so that you're actually producing and attracting the right kinds of investments. And this is something, I'm not bringing anything new. This has been in the literature. The UN system has been, calling for this for decades. UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has been very clear about what the Global South needs to be doing for the last 30 years. But when it comes to the institutions that promote and fund this type of economic development, that is the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, they go completely against the recommendations of UNCTAD, the ILO, UNDP, and they continue to support the extractive model, the race to the bottom. That has to be challenged. We're not going to go anywhere unless we challenge that type of industrialization. Now, in terms of us putting forward a clear vision and a coherent plan for economic development, that's the easy part. The challenging part is who is going to resist it, not just internationally, because most of the resistance is actually not in the global north. It's domestic. It's the abusive market power that certain key players have accumulated over time from the existing economic development model. I'll give you an example. If we decide today we're going to support food security and food sovereignty in Tunisia so that we produce the wheat that we need domestically, who are going to be the first key players who will object and try to destroy that goal? It's the key players who benefit from having the exclusive import licenses for food, for fuel, for medical equipment, because they have a monopoly power that's been handed to them over the decades. And with that monopoly power, they accumulate not only wealth and economic power, but political influence. They're going to be the first people to destroy your renewable energy policy, the first people to destroy your food security policy, because it challenges their power in the market. So we have to have a clear vision, and we have to know who are we going to tax, who are we going to regulate, which market power we're going to regulate out of existence in order to facilitate these movements that we're trying to build domestically. And that is on us. So in a sense, the president's anti-corruption campaign is intuitively going in the right direction, but I don't get a sense that it's part of a complete coherent vision that says, yes, we're going after these corrupt key players and monopolies. I feel like it's the first step in the right direction, but I don't see the rest of the vision. I see the assumption that if we go after these handful of abusers in the system who control the system, everything else will be fine with the existing economic model. And for this, I mean, we have a massive amount of information about how these networks function. Don't take my word for it. I mean, our Tunisia's commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in one of the sessions, interviews on national TV with Ahmed Trabilsi, who's one of the major oligarchs of the former regime. He told them exactly how he did it. And he told them, by the way, I'm in prison right now, and my people tell me that what I used to do, other people are still doing today in the system. This is 2017, 2018. So we know these networks are there. And of course, they interface, not just in the business world, in the political system, as we have dozens of MPs who joined the parliament to protect themselves from government regulations and so on. But it's the security system, and this is where WIAM's expertise is really relevant here, because we're talking about border control, we're talking about trafficking in goods and services. And when you think about traffickers, not just in Tunisia, but in any cross-border trafficking, the people who run trafficking networks, they're private players interfacing with security officers, with corrupt security officers, which means people with guns control economic networks and protect economic networks. And that makes it much more challenging to tackle that kind of corruption, because it's within the security system too. And finally, when it comes to that type of security system, it's not just security system in terms of trafficking, air conditioners or DVD players or milk and sugar across the border. Traffickers traffic everything. They traffic weapons, they traffic drugs, they traffic people, they traffic everything. And that is clearly the case in Tunisia and many parts of the global south. So having a clear vision for food security, for economic security, and all of that is all fine and dandy, and it's beautiful, but not linking this to the anti-corruption and security sector reform in a coherent way with that economic vision means that we'll be battling underground networks of business empires and security corruption empires, which means we're not going anywhere. And when I think of transitions and reforms, we have to be very careful to avoid thinking of key individuals and personalities. We're thinking that if we remove them, the system will be clean. No, we're talking about institutions in the institutional sense of the term, meaning not just organizations, but unwritten codes of behavior, habits of thoughts and routines of behaviors that are deeply rooted in every aspect of society. And in the security system, we've had long debates about this in Tunisia and other parts of the world, that it's not enough to remove the abusive, bosses in the security system. You have to change the training manual. You have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to retrain your lowest ranking officers, in the sense that, if the system trained you to get confessions with violence, or you must get a confession from any suspect, then you're going to do that, regardless of who your boss is, right? I'm going to get you a confession with any means. The same applies in the economic system. If you're trying to extract value from the system by exploiting workers, you're still going to exploit it with corruption or without corruption. So we have to rethink all the rules of the game. And we have to do this in a sense as you have to fix the car as you're driving it, right? We're not going to stop the world for 10 years and fix everything. We're going to have to, marshal all of our resources, intellectual capabilities, and in an open and pluralistic way, so that we collectively have this vision and own it and implement it. And that can't be done with the one person in the presidency, especially this one person that we have. We have to remember that he didn't come to the presidency with a political party and an establishment within the governance system. He was elected as a lone man, essentially, by millions of Tunisians who wanted to vote out the corrupt system. He was put into this position because of integrity, because of lack of connection to political establishment and business establishment. And these are good things, but also they come with the liability of not having actual allies within the organizational structures of government and government institutions to actually carry out that vision. So it's not going to happen with just with him and a handful of people in his office, when no matter what the good intentions are, it has to be all of us in a clear public discourse about what we're about to do. And this is something that the outside world doesn't recognize in Tunisia. After July 25th, they think that Tunisian public all of a sudden gave up on democracy and is embracing dictatorship. When obviously, if you spend more than 5 minutes in Tunisia or in Tunisian discourse, you recognize that the most careful critics of the president are people who actually supported the July 25th decisions, not just the July 25, but the July 25 decisions and what needs to be done next. And that's the movement that's currently applying pressure. And hopefully that pressure will materialize in the sense of generating a clear transition that's not just cosmetic, of recreating another parliament, recreating another political establishment, and then facing the same challenges again in a few years.
Thank you, Fadel. I note that you really focus on the systemic approach of the problem. There are no individual solutions to collective problems at the end of the day. And the problem with fighting corruption is usually we go for individuals. We don't look at the systemic and the institutional basis for corruption or for certain economic model. I also know that caution is in order. While you know that the president has made few good steps, it's not yet sure whether this will be followed by a systemic overhaul or with a vision that encompasses a systemic change, both at the economic, political, and security level. And talking about security, I'll turn to Wiam, so if you can give us your take on where do you see the developments heading in Tunisia, what the likeliest scenario in your view. Wiam?
Thanks. Thanks to everyone who spoke before me as well. I think the key thing that we should be looking out for is very much a perpetuation of certain systems, as Fadel has mentioned. And I think the key thing to keep in mind here is that what's happening in Tunisia right now is very interesting in terms of, as I mentioned, the president not necessarily being, one of those people who rose out of the system, who, has been shaped by it and has his own networks within it. And so that means that to try and kind of get to this, his professed, desire to deal with corruption, means that he needs to use security forces. And Fadel mentioned something interesting about how you can't just deal with security sector reform at the top level, but you also have to train the most low-ranking officer. And I've actually been working in that field for many years now. I've actually worked on a project that focuses specifically on training and pedagogy for security officers. And I can tell you that in itself is also not enough. And you can keep going to that systems approach and thinking about what else needs to be done. And then you've got the judiciary, which also is extremely important, because without it, you have almost zero accountability for security officers and for the Ministry of Interior, and zero accountability in anywhere really for any of the ministries in Tunisia, including itself. So the interesting thing there is that he's in a delicate position. So as someone who is trying to kind of shape, perhaps I hope he is trying to shape or think about what's going to happen next, he's in a delicate position because he's made his key point and his key policy anti-corruption at the moment. That seems to be the key thing that he's working on. And to, you know, investigate corrupt people and arrest them and deal with them, you need the security sector. And then eventually you're also going to need the judiciary. And ideally you need both at the same time. And what we're observing here is that it's very difficult to, I mean, and what I think we all know, it's very difficult to work with an unreformed security sector and have them operate with you and on your behalf properly if you're attacking them from day one. So I've seen something really interesting, for example, how on, I think it was September 8th, when, or earlier, I'm not sure, but anyway, last, you know, in the past, in the first 10 days of September, the president, you know, spoke to a number of high level security officials and said, you know, the way that you have, you know, that the security forces have dealt with this protest in downtown Tunis was inappropriate. We have to respect, you know, the freedom of protest, the freedom of speech, and you know, that's great. Discourse-wise, to bring together people from the Ministry of Interior and to tell them the day off or the next day, you know, that behavior of security officers was inappropriate and contrary to basically the rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution. But then again, you know, within, you know, 7 days or less, he was also, you know, celebrating the National Guard's anniversary and talking about how he is, you know, committed to creating an association for security officers because they are, you know, the bravest and the best and the most professional, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for those who were injured or martyred on the job, which is something that security unions have always been focusing on a great deal. And it's really interesting to me that he's kind of, you know, on both camps, basically, you know, trying to be, you know, the constitutional you know, expert that he is, and the one who's kind of outside the system, talking about, you know, average people or even just activists, not just everyone, but, you know, specifically people who are on the street protesting and saying, you know, these people need to be treated right by your forces, but then also kind of being very much part of the national, the very famous, how do we say it, the very usual, I can't find the right word, discourse around, you know, the anti-terrorism kind of policies in Tunisia, the kind of extremely militaristic, securitarian approach to understanding the Ministry of Interior, police, etc. Not service-oriented, not, you know, basically about, you know, very politicized. Basically, the discourse around the security sector in Tunisia is very politicized, very much within the realm of that kind of highly securitarian approach, very militaristic, very anti-terrorism focused. And that's a discourse that Saied has been, you know, communicating with since his campaign when it comes to security forces. And to me, that doesn't mean that he's you know, necessarily an autocrat or someone who wants to use the Ministry of Interior. I think that it's difficult to, I mean, thinking in terms of political strategy, it's just difficult to get somewhere with an anti-corruption agenda without those forces. So I think the biggest thing to watch out for is how one or the other is going to co-opt. You know, one is going to co-opt the other, whether it's, you know, this using the ministry to kind of deal with anti-corruption agendas, or vice versa. But to me, this is just in terms of like likely scenarios in that field. But there's so much more to tackle, and as Fadl said, you know, the more urgent kind of questions are very much focused on you know, the food that we eat, the dependency that we have as a country on loans, on and the impact of those loans and grants on the way that our economy operates and the way that our lives are impacted. You know, public hospitals have struggled so much with COVID, not because we don't have the right, you know, techniques or the right technology or the right, you know, capacities amongst our medical staff, but very much because of, you know, freezes on public spending, freezes on wage hire increases, freezes on wage on new hires within these sectors imposed by external lenders. And I think that, you know, that kind of element of what we're seeing in Tunisia happening, again, still hasn't been tackled by the president in his discourse. And to me, that's the, and we keep talking about him specifically because right now he's in a position where he's the one who needs to answer to questions like this. The scenarios that I see right now is that this kind of lack of communication from the presidency can't last very long. I think if there's anyone within his team who is in any way attuned to the public, you know, public sentiment, they are going to very quickly catch on that something needs to give, something needs to be communicated, a clear roadmap, a referendum decision, something needs to be communicated, even on popular decisions such as, you know, banning, you know, some businessman from traveling, even on popular decisions such as firing a certain person or replacing them. People are starting to ask a lot of questions, and that is, I think, the first thing that I'm hoping, even as a Tunisian, I have to say it, I mean, not just as a kind of a specialist or whatever, as a Tunisian, I'm hoping that we will be getting some kind of clear communication. The second thing would be, I would, you know, very much dream to see in that communication some kind of clarity on very, very key questions in Tunisia when it comes to, you know, our debt as a nation, our policies going forward on, and Fadl talked about, you know, food sovereignty, you know, where are we moving with that? Is this even something as an agenda, you know, on the agenda, or is all of this purely political? And of course, nothing is purely political. But is this really just about, you know, changing the constitution, changing the presidential system, dealing with the parliament? Because the communication that the parliament is in itself the imminent danger does not make sense if we're not tackling policy issues, whether it's security, economics, development, food, whatever. It doesn't make sense because the parliament is there to pass and affect and change laws and policies. And if it's all simply about the politics of it or the corruption question, then we're not dealing with the way in which the parliament was kind of a hindrance in some cases to developing alternatives, to changing, you know, the laws or the policies that have been affecting the everyday life of Tunisians. So I think for me, the key likely scenario, and the one that I think, you know, obviously there are online, you can find a lot of theories about, you know, he's going to turn it into a presidential system following a referendum. You know, this is going to keep going over and over, extension after extension. This or that person is going to be prime minister. I don't want to talk about that specifically. I just think that if anyone on the president's team is listening, I would expect, you know, hopefully the most likely scenario would be some clear communication about next steps. You also asked us to talk about recommendations and likely solutions, but I feel like I've already spoken for so long, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. I mean, we're going for another round where we can have recommendations and suggestions, but I definitely echo your sentiment that a lack of communication increases the uncertainty and absence of clarity, and might become a backlash. People start becoming suspicious, not knowing where this whole thing is heading. Yusuf, you spoke of a third scenario. So before you delve into suggestions or recommendations from your own global experience, I'd like you to just briefly talk about that third scenario, then provide few recommendations and suggestions how things can be resolved in the right manner for the sake of Tunisians in general. Yusuf?
I think elements of the third scenario have already been touched upon, which is the president comes out with a roadmap that has the elements that, you know, a new government, some ideas of how to live with the existing institution and the constitution while reforming it. And so that is what people think is going to be the likely scenario. But given that we are short of time, I would like just to make a couple of recommendations as to what can be done to reduce the chances of the bad scenario and enhance the at least enhance the likelihood of the most constructive one. And really, it depends on us. So I'll make 2 points on what I mean by us. You've mentioned earlier collective leadership. Collective leadership means we're not looking for solution to come from the people who are in power. They have to organically come from us, us as civil society, us as Tunisians. And I'd like to mention two elements. One is, and I think my good friend Fadel mentioned it, is we need to start knowledge decoloniality, if I may put it this way. We need to produce knowledge and propose knowledge that frees us from the dominant hegemonic paradigms that we have been laboring under, that are not working even in those places that have been selling them. And clearly the economic breakdown that you talked about, where we move from extraction to production to transport to consumption, is clearly has not worked for the West, is not going to work for us. And so we have enough knowledge and experience to be able to produce, to free those paradigms that we have been holding onto for dear life from the assumptions that have informed them, which are erroneous assumptions. They are, you know. The second is perhaps a suggestion, perhaps ICDI with like-minded civil society organization and think or do tanks in Tunisia, start making propositions in all these fields we've talked about, from climate change to economic, to food, to agriculture, to security sector reform. Something that can be quickly put together so the next government that comes on board has something to work with. These ideas, they exist, but I think it behooves us to create a space, a structured, safe space for collecting these policy ideas into one cohesive document that show the future. In other words, we need to start co-authoring that future, each one of us coming from their own perspective and knowledge. And this is urgent in my view. The sooner we can do it, the better. There are some, incipient discussions, and Khadija has been involved in some of them, but I think we need now to galvanize and break this monopoly and not, attentism. We're not going to wait, and we need to really move forward in these critical areas that are feasible, that are doable. And as I think Father mentioned, we need to move with them while we are fixing the car. So that is my humble suggestion. Decolonizing knowledge. You know, there are so many activities taking place on the African continent in what they call decolonial peace. How about decolonial economics? How about decolonial economics for climate change? And so on and so forth. So that is the thinking type. And then the other one is the proposition type, where we can come up, we and so many other like-minded Tunisians come up with a roadmap of our own, and to facilitate the work of whatever next government that will come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Khadija, what do you think? What would you suggest then to help resolve this stalemate in Tunisia?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf, for what you mentioned. First of all, yes, Einstein is, the quote is very important. The situation is too complex for us to be able to provide just answers. And I like very, very much what you just said, co-author the future. I just love it. And I think this is what we tried to do. I tried to do with 4 more people in Tunisia, coming from different background, but definitely independent people. We don't belong to any political party or so. And together we did write a vision and we did provide a roadmap and we suggested so many solutions because we didn't want to be just sitting there criticizing what is happening or the fact that the president is unable to provide whatever roadmap. We did it. So, and in my mind, frankly speaking, for the webinar, I didn't speak much because I thought that we will give a chance to all the audience to ask questions, and it will be 2 ways. And this is why I was much more referring to all what I've been writing rather than speaking about it for the sake of time. And this is why for this roadmap and vision, I want to refer the audience for those who are interested to what we publish in Leaders. So because again, it is economy is very important, but if you don't have the right leadership to really implement all the beautiful ideas that Fadel has been talking about from the economic point of view, or that was speaking about security, and of course about all the other things that we did, because we spoke about agriculture, you name it. I mean, it's all domain at all level, everything that needs to be happening in Tunisia, because really these 10 years, and again, really it was an uprising, it was never a revolution, but if we want to have a real revolution, then we have to analyze through the spiral dynamic lenses, where are the people of Tunisia? Where are we on those stages of the spiral dynamic? And let's not fool ourselves by thinking that all Tunisians belong to that stage of the modern state or the humanity or the cosmos. It's not true. 70%, and this is my own statistics, they're not scientifically done, are much more in the other 3 stages of the individual, the family, the tribal stage. And this is why 10 years ago, they voted the Nahda. It's not a surprise, they have to. But now, of course, 10 years later, we gave a chance to another Muslim Brotherhood we had to run, and we saw clearly what happened. So now the things will be different. But if you want a true revolution, let's do it really the right way. Let's suggest the right solution for our people. And for now, again, it is only by producing, and I love this, producing the knowledge and this decolonizing, all of the beautiful thing that Dr. Yusuf has been suggesting. Let's do it. Let's do it together, collectively, as independent citizens, doing it just for the love of Tunisia, because really Tunisia deserves the best. Thank you very much.
I agree with you. We do have a few questions that I will ask you that I will receive from the audience, by the way. We'll try to keep it brief because we're beyond the time anyway. Fadel?
Well, and I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just add a couple of things and then maybe allow for more discussion for VM and for the questions. Since we've been talking about Einstein, he said, you know, it's the very definition of insanity to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And when it comes to what I was discussing in terms of the economic model, and this is a problem beyond Tunisia. If you look at, and Dr. Khadija mentioned the political Islam in the region, if you look at the economic policy platform of all the political Islam parties, you know, from Egypt to Tunisia, Morocco, when they took office and they were asked, what is your economic agenda? They said tourism, foreign direct investment, exports, remittances, you know, more brain drain, the exact same, but we're going to do it with ethical norms, as if it's going to produce a different result. So I think at this point we understand that we can't restart that same engine. The thing that worries me the most about where the president is in terms of his thinking is a couple of things. You know, if inflation is a problem, asking merchants to lower their prices is not an economic strategy. Begging the lowest ranking individuals and calling on their patriotism to fix the economy is not a strategy, right? That's point number one. Point number two, which is an important point that Wiam mentioned earlier, which is not recognizing that the state has the capacity to fund economic development in the most neglected areas of the economy, that it's the responsibility of the state. This is something that Saied expressed in his anti-corruption sort of strategy, is to offer individuals who have ill-gotten money from their business empires to receive mea culpa, essentially, from the president, if they just help us with their money to fund economic development in the neglected area. That is just accepting defeat on the anti-corruption campaign period, but also accepting defeat in terms of what the state can do, what the state's responsibility is for the hundreds of thousands of young people in the most neglected geographic areas of the country. And so that scares me in the sense that there is actually no strategy here other than hopes that integrity and anti-corruption campaigns will just produce magical results. And I hope that very quickly we'll get some answers either from the president and his team or invitations from the president and his team for people who have been doing work in this space, independent, not political parties, not political establishment, to lay out the public discourse and formulate this co-authored future that Dr. Mahmoud has mentioned earlier. And I truly believe that a better world is within reach. We're not talking about impossible missions here. We're talking about things that are within reach, but you can't reach there without a coherent vision and without recognizing what the obstacles are and what the actual tools are to take this vision and make it operational so that people actually directly benefit from it.
Thank you, Fadil. Wiam, your suggestions?
Yeah, I guess picking up on some of what the co-panelists have been saying, I'd say that understanding a little bit more, as Fadil earlier mentioned, where the obstacles lie is key. And talking about the state as kind of one homogeneous thing, or talking about a majority of Tunisians being one way or the other, kind of makes it a little bit difficult for us to do that. Having worked, for example, with ministries in Tunisia, I think all of you as well, you know, through your careers in the UN, have worked with ministries in different countries. You would know that there's different levels of resistance and, you know, and also, you know, support for change and different levels of those ministries. And I think that one of the things that we are looking at a lot at the moment because of the political moment that we are in is that political question of, political Islam, etc. And I like what Fadl said about it is kind of bringing it back to the reality that it's not about just the political Islam vision, which people could be with or against, but it's more about the liberal capitalistic tendencies of that movement and that political group. And I think that that's the issue here. It's kind of what visions do you have for the society, whether it's or the economy or the different sectors within that economy and within that country, and it boils down to a great deal to non-identitarian questions most of the time. And one of the things that has led us to the crisis that we were in were these identitarian questions and debates that started way before any of this. It started as early as early 2011. Even in February, March 2011, there were kind of attempts to raise the identity question much more than the Tunisian society was actually kind of pondering with at the time. And that has very much created the space for the kind of political divisions that we have seen. I think that the way that people voted and the way that we have, the experience that we've had over the past 10 years is mostly the result of economic conditions more than anything. In many neighborhoods, I have observed firsthand, and I think all of us have as Tunisians, and the use of discourse on politics of identity to basically respond to was never enough. There were always economic incentives given to people to get them to vote that way, and Nahda did not manage to be in power for so long purely by using the identity and conservative politics that people think has been its bread and butter. I think most of how it has achieved what it has achieved is very much through providing solutions to people's economic problems on a very micro level that never fixes things in the long term. Your son's circumcision, or making it easier for someone to open up a corner shop, or supporting a family financially, even for a short period around elections time. All of these are things that have shown that they have understood more than anyone that the real ailments of Tunisians over the past 10 years, and as a result of Ben Ali's policies, because they found that terrain in 2011. They didn't find that terrain only after 2014 or so. So they recognized that those ailments were economic. I just wanted to make that point because I think recognizing what the problem was and is, and what it continues to be, and why dynamics take the shape that they do, I think is key. And then the other point, regarding, again, the ministries and versus the state versus the politics of things, I think that the best recommendation that, or the best way forward is recognizing those huge differences within the structures that kind of operate in the government and that produce the kind of results that we see. And those are not only internal but also external. We've spoken about the impositions and the recommendations and of external lenders to Tunisia, whether it's the EU or it's a certain country, or most prominently international financial institutions. But then it's also the internal dynamics within the country. Fadl spoke about cooptation of certain ministerial ministries through those corruption networks, through the people who aren't necessarily corrupt but have actually benefited really well from the systems in place. I think that there's also another kind of resistance to change. And I'm choosing to speak here beyond the point of developing a plan. Khadija has developed a plan. Yusuf has recommended ways to move forward with those plans. I think different plans, different perspectives can be developed, but the implementation phase, I think, outside of what civil society can do and outside of what a certain quote-unquote elite can do, I think the real difficulty will be working with the resistance within, the structures. And one of those things that I thought about from the from the perspective of food sovereignty and trying to rethink, alternatives for questions around agriculture in Tunisia, is the strong reliance on modernity and modernization discourse within the fields of agroengineering, for example. And I learned this from, people like Habib Aib, who have been working on it for a while, the founder of the observatory that I'm currently the president of. And, he will explain, exactly how very well-intentioned, very well-meaning public officials and engineers who work for our public industries will promote a certain discourse around the benefits and the value of modernization of agricultural processes in increasing yield and that have actually ended up making us more and more dependent and less sovereign over time. And that kind of obsession in Tunisian public administration with a certain type of discourse or approach and has resisted alternatives that actually call for returning to different methods that actually lead to less of that dependency. And so that question of decolonization of knowledge, of praxis, I think is essential, that Dr. Yusuf mentioned. But kind of connecting it with an awareness that is not only to fight off or to ward off an externally imposed actions or policies, but also to fight the way that Tunisians within the governmental structures have been approaching everyday work that influences the lives of our fellow countrymen and women. So regarding the security sector, very briefly, likely, solutions, recommendations. I think it's a very thorny issue. It's something that I've been working on for a while now, and I would just say that it's something that really requires an understanding of the ministry, an understanding of the judiciary, an understanding of the extreme resistance that such initiatives will get, and it requires honestly courage, because I do believe that we are at a point where the true reform of that sector, or even kind of reimagining it entirely, which I would prefer over reform, and that would be reimagining it as a structure that responds to citizens' needs, that responds to a very limited job description that is very much service-oriented, and that is not kind of a catch-all for both political, social, and economic methods of responding to those kinds of, that is not a way of responding to social, political, and economic demands and protests and signs of fragility around those questions. So reimagining it entirely or reforming it would require courage, because I think the level of resistance has reached a point where it will imply physical harm to people who try to actually do the right work in that field. Okay. And so I am not extremely optimistic about a very gradual approach, a very personal approach. I think that it's going to be extremely difficult to reform it to the extent that people aspire to, without reaching for certain, for some really strong decisions to be made at the level of the judiciary first and foremost. So that's my not very optimistic perspective on that, and I'm sorry.
Thank you. Actually, we way beyond the time scheduled for this webinar. We've received a few questions. Unfortunately, we cannot tackle all of them, because I would like to give the floor to the chairman, Jamal bin Omar, to close. But just before that, one question that I kept receiving, and I can just ask it, and we can take a few seconds briefly to just say yes or no, basically, all of you. Do you think that Tunisia needs another national dialogue like the one that happened in 2011 or not? Yusuf? We don't hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Briefly, please.
The answer is no.
Okay, that's very brief. Khadija?
Definitely no. Absolutely no.
Okay. Fadel?
It's complicated.
Go ahead.
But I see where the no comes from. And I do lean on, definitely not going into establishment type of conversations, hijacking the framework and framing the new direction. We've done that. We can't go back to the same issues. I think this is a time for a different kind of conversation and a realistic conversation. The reality is that the president is in charge. He's got everything in his hands, regardless of whether you believe it's a coup or not a coup or which direction we're going. So we need immediate decisions that are informed by the popular demands from 2010 and 2011. These are not new popular demands. And these are the popular demands that brought in all the other political parties: justice, democracy, freedom, jobs. We know what the issues are. We've tried the same kind of rehashing of older models of economic and political democracies. Those have backfired and created a disaster in the case of Tunisia. So yes, no to restarting the same processing and ending up in the same place. But yes to a different kind of dialogue for transformative solutions, not band-aid solutions.
Thank you, Fadel. Wiam, briefly, what do you think on this?
I very much follow what Fadel was saying. I think, depends on the kind of dialogue, depends on who's invited to the table. I think the biggest thing that we've seen a lack of so far is the presidency inviting people who are not part of what is supposed to be the establishment and the elite in Tunisia. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to see, a real conversation that starts at the bottom and goes up. Because I don't think there's been delocalized dialogue kind of coming from the president spoke the most about delocalized politics. So that would be what I would like to see.
Thank you. Thank you all for a fascinating discussion. I mean, it's really fascinating to have all your views and take on the situation in Tunisia. Let me give the floor now for closing remarks to the chairman of ICDI, Jamal Ben Omar. Jamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will be brief, but definitely the brief answers that I heard from you about the last question lead me to believe that we need a follow-up conversation that will focus mainly on this issue. It's complicated. Your responses were very nuanced, clearly, and therefore, there is a need for another follow-up conversation. But I will not repeat what's been said very eloquently by our four distinguished guests. The one thing I want to emphasize is that, yes, there have been ups and downs and moments of despair, moments of hope, times when people are uncertain, but I want to assure you that you have no idea how attentive, the people who love Tunisia have been to what's been going on. In late 80s, early 90s, when the democratic revolution swept the world in Africa, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, it stopped at the gate of North Africa and the Middle East. And we had to wait many, many years until Tunisians decided to rebel against tyranny and despotism. And that was the start of the Arab Spring. That gave hope, that maybe one day in North Africa and the Middle East, we can have human rights and democracy. And when this Arab Spring turned into a sad winter, cold winter, what kept the hope alive, was the success of the Tunisians in coming together and moving forward with their transition to democracy. And even when things got rough and the transition got stuck in 2013, 2014, they found a way through initiatives from civil society organizations to come together and work out a way out that later on, proved helpful, useful, but the lesson that we can learn from that today is that Tunisian will always find a way somehow, to figure out a way on how to chart a new path that will advance Tunisian transition to democracy and keep that hope, our hope of democracy and human rights in the Arab world alive. So thank you for your participation. This is the first meeting, the first conversation that hopefully will be followed by many other conversations with you, and we stand ready to support you in any possible way forward. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.